Hi. Hey. Hi. Thank you all for coming. I see a lot of people I know. I'm really honored that you're being here tonight. My name's Daniel Solnit, as Rebel said. I was fortunate enough to be raised in a family of activists. You may know some of my siblings. And I've been working on climate for about 15 years. I'm currently working as a union organizer, but I've done direct action organizing and NGOs and various other things too. I've always been interested in two things. One is how we can be most effective. The folks we're up against usually have more money, more guns, more lawyers, so we need to be smarter and more strategic than them. And I've also always been interested in the psychology of how people change, how people make change. So I want to talk about a little bit of that tonight in relation to the climate movement. And I want to acknowledge there's a whole lot more wisdom in this room out here than just up here. So my goal is to spend about half the time listening to what all of you have to say and trying to foster some back and forth, some dialogue. To that, first let me thank very much Occupy and the Peace Center for making this possible, for giving us this space. Grassroots organizations like these are what enable a lot of us to step out of our daily lives and do something that has an impact because they're creating a container for it. So a lot of gratitude. So I want to talk a little bit about where we are climate-wise, and I want to talk about the two biggest barriers that I see. One is political and economic, and the other is psychological. And I want to kind of lay that foundation, because if you don't know what my framework or starting assumptions are, then the strategies I want to talk about won't make as much sense. So we'll take a break about halfway through. I'll stop after each section and ask what you think and what your questions are and what you have to share. And we will try and end right around 9. So, before I jump in, let me just ask, how many people are brand new to the climate issue and know pretty much nothing about it? You? Just me. Oh, good, I'm done. How many know the basics but feel like they couldn't explain all the details to a friend? How many people have been at it a while and feel like they could actually explain what's causing climate and maybe climate change and some of the solutions to pass? Okay. How many folks are in some kind of leadership capacity in the movement, like running a national nonprofit or something? Okay. All right, so there's a lot of experience and expertise in the room. Great. For most of human history, at least the last 100,000 years, we have been living off what Thomas Hartman calls recent sunlight, the energy stored in plants, in animals, in natural systems. We relied mostly on our own muscle power, that of animals, wind, water, wood for fuel, and that was true up until a few centuries ago. Something happened about 250 years ago. We discovered how to burn fossil fuels, primarily coal. And that changed pretty much everything. Everyone in an industrialized part of the world suddenly had 50, 100, 200 times as much energy at their disposal as they had before. And that led to some dramatic changes. The population grew exponentially. That in itself was not the core problem. If all those people were still living the way medieval peasants were in terms of impact, we wouldn't be in a climate crisis. The problem was all those many more people were also burning fossil fuels. And that grew exponentially as well. What's striking to me is that about 30 years ago, half of all the fossil fuel carbon emissions we've caused since the Industrial Revolution happened in the last 30 years, basically since the first climate summit. And you can see how well we've done at changing direction so far.
Half of what?
Half of all the carbon emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution happened in the last 30 years. There's more of us, we're getting much more consumptive, more people have access to things that use a lot of energy and put out a lot of carbon. So we've doubled the problem since Kyoto, basically, or since Rio, rather. Now, this is a tiny blip in the course of human history, if you take the long view of it. When we were cutting down a tree or taking a fish out of the stream, that was renewable, it grew back. Fossil fuels are not renewable. We're using them like a 21-year-old who just got his trust fund and is throwing a huge party and is rapidly going to run out of money. We would already be at peak oil or past it if we weren't doing things like tar sands and shale oil. So we are forestalling peak production. Peak doesn't mean we're going to run out tomorrow. It means that production globally will decline, particularly with oil, and that all the remaining oil will get harder and harder to extract. We'll have to put platforms in the North Sea where it's extremely stormy and dangerous and costly. Or we'll have to do things like tar sands, which barely have a return on the energy expended. Anyone familiar with the term energy return on energy invested? Okay, a lot of you. So basically that's asks, for every unit of energy, every barrel of oil you use, extracting and refining it, how much energy do you get back? And back when that photo was taken, it was about 25, 30 to 1. So it was very cheap. It was near the surface. It was easy to process. It was high, light crude oil. More recently, it's been 10 to 1, 8 to 1, even 4 to 1. Shale oil, I just read something recently said it's about 2 to 1. Half the energy we get out of shale oil goes into extracting it, refining it. So it's actually not cost effective. It's a net loss economically, not to mention what it does to the planet. The other problem, of course, is that most of the oil we're extracting these days is in war zones. Or more, it just, how did our oil get under their sand? I think it'd be more truthful to say most war zones are where the oil happens to be. So if you look at what's going on currently with Iran, with Iraq, with Syria, with Turkey, with Ukraine just off the map here in the Black Sea, which is a primary route. This is Sevastopol, the other Sevastopol. Russia's primary seaport for exporting oil and gas. There's a reason they took Crimea. And just off the map to this side is Afghanistan, which a couple of the major oil companies were seriously considering for a alternative pipeline route. So pretty much everything going on in this region is tied to oil one way or another. And that has a cost. It has an impact on our foreign policy, and it has an impact on our entire society. More than half the discretionary spending of the federal government goes to war and preparations and the consequences of war. It's about 5 cents out of every dollar. Globally, it's about $2 trillion a year, which is about what it would cost to seriously address climate. So it's not that we can't afford it, it's just a matter of priorities. There's typically three approaches: prevention, keep it from happening; mitigation, try and reduce the impacts; and adaptation, which is learning to live with it. I think we can take prevention off that list. The last time that was a realistic possibility was, I'd say, between 30 and 45 years ago. That leaves mitigation and adaptation. The three ways to do this is to put out less carbon, to pull some of the carbon out of the atmosphere, and to protect or restore or enhance the systems, natural systems that already store and keep carbon. Most of the attention goes to reducing carbon, because that's what's most obvious to us. It comes out of our tailpipes, our electric power plants, our heating, our industrial production. This is not an industrial process directly, but a lot of it is indirectly tied to fossil fuel. And a lot of the methane that comes out and it mostly comes out this end, not that end, by the way, is, okay. What we pay less attention to is the stored carbon. It's called sequestered. They often call these carbon sinks. Rainforests like the Amazon are among the most important ones. When a piece of the Amazon is burned to make way for more cows, you lose all the carbon in the trees, obviously, is going up in the air, but also the carbon in the soil gets released because it's now exposed, it's not protected by the trees. And as the surrounding trees dry out, they start to die too. Rainforests, particularly large ones like the Amazon, make their own weather and create their own cloud cover. And so every time we lose a piece of it, it does damage and lessens the amount of carbon that the rest of it can pull down. There's two concepts I want to share. One is that climate change is not linear, and that's a challenge for a lot of folks we talk to every day, because we're used to thinking in terms of linear sequential processes. You know, if I put a little more carbon out, then it'll get a little warmer. And that's actually not the case with the systems we're talking about. They're more complex and they have tipping points. Tipping point is where the entire state of a system changes abruptly. You can think of the straw that broke the camel's back. This is where, you know, you drop 99 pebbles in and it's fine. You drop the 100th and the whole thing tips over. There are a few tipping points. One is Greenland. This is an old chart. The melt is more serious now. It's not just surface melt. The water gets underneath the ice, which is 2 miles thick in some places. If that happens enough and we get enough melting going on between the bottom of the ice sheet and the landmass, there's a possibility that much of this ice could end up in the North Atlantic, shutting down the sort of conveyor belt Atlantic currents that in turn could put much of Northern Europe into what some are describing as an ice age. A lot of people forced to become refugees, a lot of crop failure and so on. So that's one tipping point. Another one is the polar ice sheet. This is probably the most immediate one that we're losing. The ice is very smooth and very white. It reflects almost all the heat from the sun back out away from the earth. As the ice melts and sunlight hits the much darker, choppy water, it mostly gets absorbed. And the water heats up. The warmer water melts more ice, and this is an accelerating cycle. It's what they call a positive feedback loop or a reinforcing feedback loop. And it creates what's called cascading effects. This is the other thing that's hard for people to wrap their brains around with climate. That, you know, if a little shift here causes a shift here, and then here, and then here. A little bit of warming somewhere in the mid-Atlantic ends up causing a hurricane on the Gulf Coast. And it's hard for people who don't study these systems to make those connections, but that's a lot of what we're dealing with. Probably the most serious tipping point we're looking at is the methane that's stored in permafrost, which is melting more rapidly than predicted, and being released or bubbling up in some cases.
That fire is actually coming from...
Yeah, that's methane.
She didn't make the fire?
No. She just poked a hole and probably held a match to it, or not. And this is methane bubbling up from... yeah, okay. Most of the methane that's frozen in ice crystals is on the sea floor. Best estimates are, we really don't know, but between 500 and 5,000 gigatons. A gigaton is 1 million tons. We release about 10 gigatons of methane annually. So even a small release of a fraction of this could be more significant than all the carbon emissions people on the planet are responsible for today. This is the least likely tipping point, but it's one of the most concerning. There are places where the methane is already bubbling up from the ocean. This is in Siberia. And so what the International Panel on Climate Change is asking us to do is to hold emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And they're saying we need to not go beyond that. The first climate conferences were talking about 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees. Those were based on politics, not science. The reason 1.5 degrees is their best estimate based on the current science is that if we stay within 1.5 degrees, we will have about a 1 in 2 or maybe a 2 in 3 chance of not going into the full-blown catastrophic climate impacts, what they call runaway climate. And that's a situation where we get one of these snowballing effects, these positive feedback loops that's beyond human control, that we can no longer influence, that is just going. And that's what can get us to 4, 5, 6 degrees of warming and large swaths of the planet becoming uninhabitable, at least for humans. So that's why they pick. Now, a 1 in 2 or even a 2 in 3 chance of avoiding it may not sound like a lot, but if we're playing Russian roulette and I've got a pistol with 2 bullets in it and a pistol with 4 bullets in it, which one are you going to want to choose? Because the pistol with no bullets in it is long gone. So that's the situation we're in. We're already well into the impacts. It's going to get worse, but we have roughly 10 years to avoid a much more serious risk of a runaway train, essentially, a runaway climate situation. We've already warmed the planet about 1 degree. Some folks say 1.2. There's a lot of debate about how much more is in the pipeline. What comes out of our tailpipes and factories today doesn't instantly warm the planet. Most of the impact is going into the oceans, about 90% of it. And so there's a time delay. It's not exactly 20 years. It depends on what it is and what system it's affecting and where on the planet. But essentially, there is a pipeline. There is a time delay. There's at least 0.5 degree, possibly significantly more, in the pipeline. So we may already be locked into more than 1.5 degrees, which means what we need to do is not just slow down, but reverse course. We need to figure out how to get to 0 as quickly as possible and how to start sequestering carbon. That means restoring forests, restoring wetlands, using biochar in soil, all kinds of things that will bring the carbon back out of the air. One of the things that I've been reading recently is a paper by a British academic named Jim Bendel. This paper's famous for sending people into severe depression and having to go to their therapist. See that we have some here tonight. Therapism. His argument, and he doesn't have a lot to back it up scientifically, really we don't know. But his argument is that we're really unlikely to stay below 1.5, and he takes the risk of large methane emissions from the tundra and the ocean floor quite seriously. He thinks it's more of a risk than the IPCC scientists do. And so his argument is, yeah, we should still try and avoid it, but mostly we should focus on adaptation, and not adaptation to slight inconvenience, adaptation to a very, very different planet. I don't agree with him, but I think it's important to at least look that far to that dark of possible future and say, all right, let's do everything we can to slow this down and reverse it, but let's also realize that we are going to lose some coastal areas. We are going to lose some agricultural production. We are going to have vastly larger numbers of refugees. What do we do with that? How do we accommodate that? So it raises the question, is it too late to mitigate? And of course, the answer is no. That's not the right question. To me, the right question is what's most effective? What can we do? And so I just very quickly want to run through a few of the things that are not sufficient by themselves. We need to do pretty much everything, but some things are more helpful than others. And my focus as an activist, not a scientist, not an elected official, is on what we can do best. We should keep trying international treaties, but it hasn't gotten us anywhere so far. We should keep pushing the federal government, but that's not working real well right now. Hopefully that'll change in about 1 year. And I want to say, the state of California is doing amazing work. The county of Sonoma is doing some good work. they need more pushing, but there's a lot of folks here in this room who are really pushing them hard. There's a lot of cities and counties and even states and in other parts of the world, countries, that are really moving in the right direction. None of them fast enough, but some of them are doing amazing stuff. It's federal governments in large countries like the US that are the biggest problem. Most market solutions are scams. Not all, but most. Cap and trade is pretty much providing cover for corporate polluters without making any significant progress. I'm sure there's exceptions to that, but every time I hear a new version of cap and trade or offsets or something, I'm very suspicious because it's usually more about the profit and the greenwashing. There are some important technological breakthroughs in battery storage, in thermal concentrators, in various ways to either capture or generate energy or capture carbon. Most of the geoengineering sounds really dangerous to me. I'm not a scientist, but that's my take. It just sounds like more of the hubris that got us into this. There is one technology that's proven, that's cost effective for pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. It's called a tree. And reforestation is one of the best ways to go about this. And last thing I want to say on this is a lot of the attention I see is on individual consumer actions. Part of the problem with the system we live under is that it has turned us from citizen activists into passive consumers. And so the answer to everything is just buy different or buy this instead of that, buy green. This, I'm sorry to say, was put out by 350.org. There's some good things on here, like riding your bike or driving your car less, eating less meat more locally. But there's some things on here like changing your bulbs that are and recycling pretty minimal. Unplugging appliances when you're not using them, like your phone charger. I mean, the amount of difference that makes is so negligible. And if we tell people that's the way to solve this, we're kind of misleading them. If we all did everything on all the lists, I mean, I'm driving my EV and, mostly not eating meat and all that stuff. I've still got a huge carbon footprint. We all do. Because a lot of things that are out of my control are still being done in my name. Industrial production. My driving an EV didn't switch us from highways to light rail or get PG&E to stop building gas peaker plants. It doesn't, because those decisions are beyond our power unless we organize. So as you can see, about a quarter of all emissions can be impacted by what we do personally. So let's do it, but let's not pretend that that's going to get us there. My take is that mass movements are what's made the most difference thus far, and they're our best hope of getting from here to where we need to be in 10 years and in 30 years. So let me pause there and take questions, comments, other people's thoughts, things I got wrong. Carol?
You're always right.
I'm not.
But the tree is the answer. I really think trees are huge. We should stop talking and start planting trees. But beyond that, I really think we need to take our money out of Chase, which Jane Fonda is now finally somebody's giving us an action. Get the money out of these big banks that are funding fossil fuels.
Yeah, here, absolutely. There are credit unions that you can be putting your money in. Yeah.
There's something that Dr. John McDougall, I was listening to the radio the other night on Coast to Coast, and that was not just eat less meat, but don't eat any dairy meat, any products like that at all. The UN Climate Commission said there years ago that the one thing that if we don't all do it, it's not going to work. We have to do all those things, but eating meat, and some scientists would say, because of trees, contributes to 51% of greenhouse gases. And people question at 51%, but I've seen it by some really reputable people saying that's a huge number, but when you're talking about trees, you're cutting all the trees down and burning all the trees. So we obviously replant the trees and regreen the planet, but so much of that land is being used for, and the water is being used for animals. Not just the cows, but all the animals.
Yeah, it takes a couple thousand gallons of water to produce a pound of beef, at least under the industrial factory farming model. So yes, Deforestation is a huge problem. Reforesting is a big part of the solution. Some of us don't want to eat no meat at all. I'll get to that. Eating less is obviously a good choice, less animal products generally. But it also matters how they're raised. Animals, even cattle that are grazed in a sustainable manner, have much less climate impact if they're not fed, soy and corn and things that aren't part of their natural diet.
There's scientific
so forth.
dispute that's true.
Yeah.
That's not true.
It's not.
And it's
Okay.
raising animals in a humane way, You don't want to kill animals to begin with because it's not necessary for human consumption to survive. So it's not only good for the environment, it's good for the animals. But
Right. And
it's
and I-
good for so many things.
I'm interested in giving people solutions that they'll go with right away, which is why I talk about.
Well, that's something you could do, everybody could do as soon as they go home.
Yeah. Okay.
I just want to ask the room if anyone's cold, because we didn't put the heat on. And we can, so if anybody gets cold, the heater is over there.
Thank you.
I just want to mention that I've read that even more important than trees is restoring wetlands, that wetlands are a much, much, much greater carbon sink than trees are. And that we've sold off our wetlands and filled them in and developed them. And that's one of
Yeah.
the very significant problems.
Yeah, that's very true. Thank you. And also, a lot of the plant life in the ocean does a lot of sequestration. We're losing a lot of that as well. Yes.
You mentioned biochar, and I wondered if you could say something about the difference between biochar and burning biomass, because I've been hearing that a lot of the forests in the US are being cut down in the name of fire safety and public safety and fire protection, and being burned, made into chips to be exported for fuel to Europe and China. And that they're talking about it as net zero waste of energy, but it isn't. Net zero emissions, but it isn't, because they're cutting down trees and they're burning, and it's actually making things a lot worse. And so when you said biochar, I know a little about it, but I don't know much about it.
I only know a little too. Anyone know enough about biochar to explain it? Yeah, right behind you. Yes.
What I understand about it, it's slow burning of of wood in the absence of oxygen to the degree possible. And the way it works is it creates a very porous char that is a perfect condition for microbes in the soil to live in. It's like a great home for them. And so it's added to the soil. Essentially it goes back to Incan times and in augmenting their rainforest soil.
Yeah, it's not burned for fuel.
No,
Yeah,
that's not the point.
it's almost like evaporating the wood to make a soil supplement
Exactly.
and putting the carbon back into the soil.
But it's long-term. One application lasts for eons, and
So doesn't the burning of it release greenhouse gas emissions?
you can capture that.
The carbon stays in the biochar.
Again, I don't know much about it. My understanding is that biochar, most of the carbon in the wood is going back into the soil and enriching the soil.
There's a movie called Need to Grow that will tell you what you'd like to know about it. A little bit.
Thank you. Let's take one or two more. All the way in the back.
Yeah, I have a climate change reversal startup that I'm working on getting off the ground. I have an unusual background in that I'm a mega activist and I'm also a corporate executive, and so it's this strange combination. And in my opinion, what we really need is we need to put the screws on these big companies. We need to put the screws on them in the pocketbook. The only way some of these companies are going to do a damn thing is to be squeezed on their bottom line. And once that happens, then we've got their attention.
Thank you. Well said.
Well, to follow up on that would be, coming at it from the bottom would be mass boycotts. And coming at it from the top would be being really attentive to who we elect and then holding them accountable. Cloning Greta Thunberg. And public banking versus private banking, which seems to be cresting. And no-till farming and supporting our organic, local, everybody.
Yes.
I actually have a whole write-up that I can give the link to people, but it's called Introducing Sustainable Movements, Ecological Alkalinity, and it's just a whole write-up of sustainable practices that can contribute to alkalizing our environment.
Wow, that sounds great.
For sure.
Do we have an easel that we can write things on? Okay. When we, at the break, would you write that up for everyone?
Yeah.
Okay. And if people have other research, they can put them up there too.
I just have a quick.
Yeah, last one.
So one of the things that I feel really terrible about when I see the news is about the Amazon burning, and that the people that live there are burning it so that they can make more land to raise cows. And I'm just wondering if there's any worldwide organizations that are saying, we'll pay you to leave the garden, to leave the trees there.
Right. Yeah, so some people in the Amazon are burning trees to make room to graze cattle, which is kind of a one and done process.
Yeah, but I mean, I understand
and some people are fighting
that
that.
from their point of view,
Right,
they're trying to pay
right.
for their lives. And
Yeah, they're trying to survive. They're subsistence farmers and ranchers, yeah.
So it
Bolsonaro's
seems to
making
me
it
if
worse.
somebody was saying, okay, well.
I don't know, but somebody in the room may. Anyone know of an organization working in the Brazilian rainforest to provide some economic alternatives to cattle farming? Okay. I'm sure somebody's working. Pachamama. Good, right, thank you. Okay. So all of this is reminding me of something I used to say in my talks, which is we have all the solutions we need. I mean, we'll find more as we go forward, but we have the solutions. That's not the problem. The problem is what's standing in our way. And so I want to talk about first the economic and political barrier. And yes, that's meant to be ironic. Not only we, but most of the world now lives under a single global financial and economic system that is based on endless growth, endless expansion, which is unsustainable. This is news to most conventional economics, but we actually live on a finite planet. And this is what Edward Abbey had to say about endless growth. And this system treats anything that isn't part of its profit making as what they call an externality, which means we're not going to pay for it and we're not going to account for it. So if our factory makes you and your kids sick or poisons the river or lays off a bunch of workers when we move to Mexico or Vietnam, that's an externality. We're not going to factor that in. It's also economically unsustainable, even within its own parameters. More and more, the system is based on less on producing goods and services. The business of America used to be making cars and washing machines. Now it's selling people derivatives and mortgage-backed securities and debt and more debt and new varieties of debt. And my own opinion is that the system's so inherently unsustainable that it's come up against a lot of limits already, both ecological but also economic limits, and is having to leverage more and more to keep going for another few years or few decades. One of the features of the system is that it concentrates more and more of the wealth on the planet into fewer and fewer hands. We've all seen that happening. That's not an accident. It's by design. That's what the system's designed to do. Its purpose is to concentrate wealth in the hands of the few. The process it uses is turning nature and our labor into garbage. That's basically what it does. And if you look at what's happened to wages over the last 40 odd years and what's happened to worker productivity, you can tell I'm a labor organizer, productivity has doubled, wages have been flat or even gone down slightly for most working folks. This represents a doubling of wealth, a doubling of GDP. Where did all that go? Where did it go? Yeah, it went into the pockets of the owning class. And the net result is that more and more working folks have more and more debt. College used to be cheap or even free. Now, my kids have massive debt they're trying to pay off from college. Anyone who gets sick without health insurance is going to go bankrupt, and so on. And it's not just us, it's our kids and future generations and people in the developing world who are being saddled with debt as well. And the folks at the top of the system, there's a couple of chairs up in front, are able to maintain a level of control, thus far at least, by having their hands on the levers of power over our currency, our trade agreements and tax policy, and so on. They managed to keep control of the economic system, financial system, by controlling the political process, buying elections, buying the people who make laws, the people who enforce them, and the people who run the legal and so-called criminal justice system. And perhaps less obviously, but more importantly, they managed to maintain social control of much of the population through the stuff we take in, the things that tell us who we are, how we should see the world, what our values are. Do we believe that we're all in this together and we need to protect the commons and look out for folks who are less advantaged? Or do we believe we're each in this for ourselves and it's dog eat dog, and if I have to step on you to get ahead, so be it? There's two conflicting value systems and worldviews in this country. And a lot of the so-called culture wars are really a clash of values. And it's very clear which value system they're selling us, particularly if you watch any reality TV. I think we're in the latter stages of what I call vulture capitalism. And there's a few characteristics. One is theft of commons. This is Cochabamba, Bolivia some years ago, where Nestle decided that the river that people had used for all of eternity to get their drinking water and that belonged to the people was now owned by Nestle. And it took several years of mass uprisings to kick them out, but the people of Cochabamba, Bolivia won. More recently, Bolivia is going through all kinds of other travails, of course, but it's characterized by increasing levels of debt and speculation and leveraging. The 2008 crash was only the most recent until the next one comes. This is in, yes. This is in Venezuela. This was taken, I think, a month ago. But globally, enforced austerity measures, which in the developing world look like the IMF coming in and saying, all right, cut wages, take away social benefits, and we're going to lend you money at high interest to build some roads and bridges you don't need. But even in developed world like this, it looks like declining wages, the attacks on unions, the rising cost of healthcare, and having to pay for things that we didn't used to have to pay for, like education and childcare. We've seen a rise in authoritarianism around the world, and a corresponding rise in corruption. And a lot of the uprisings that we're seeing right now, and I've never seen so many uprisings in so many places in the world as now, they're either in some ways fighting against authoritarianism or corruption, or basically a loss of legitimacy. We no longer trust or believe in the folks running our government, and we want them out. And the other thing it's really characterized by is popular resistance. I was going to put about 30 slides in here, but I'll just limit it to Hong Kong, where they're resisting authoritarian and attempted authoritarian rule. Chile, this started as a protest around energy hikes, as many of them did. This was recent. Yeah, this was, I believe, a month or two ago. A lot of the uprisings start around energy, around an increase in heating costs, gas costs, I'll get to another one. This is in Iraq, where it's gotten pretty bloody recently. And you've got the combination of authoritarianism, corruption, and declining standard of living and lack of access to energy and other essentials. And the Yellow Vest movement in France, again, started about a gas hike and quickly became a fight over takeaways around pension, a tax on unions, basically trying to force austerity measures on the French middle class. And they were having none of it. Yeah, okay. So, as I said, there's at least 30 or 40 countries that are having significant major uprisings as we sit here and speak. And it's usually around some combination of those issues. The government's authoritarian, the government's corrupt, their energy prices and food prices are becoming unaffordable, they're taking away our rights and our ability to support our families. And I think there's never been a better time than right now for us to organize and connect these movements. It's clear that capitalism as a system is failing. I've been waiting my whole life for it to fall, and it hasn't yet. It's much more resilient than I thought. But I think the climate deadline is unlike any other. We've been through economic crises, we've been through political crises, but this one's being enforced by the planet itself. They're not going to buy or lend or manufacture, print more money to get out of this one. This is a hard and fast deadline. And I think the possibility of transforming to something beyond crony corporate capitalism to something that's based more on ecological principles and human needs is stronger now than it's ever been. So let me stop there. What do you guys think? Will it last forever? Is it coming down tomorrow? Yeah. Go ahead.
I just wanted to make a comment based on the biochar comment earlier that the Marin Carbon Project is doing some work where they're spreading compost, and just a half an inch or a quarter of an inch, it's producing carbon sequestration benefits. So far, 6 years and counting, still continuing to sequester from one application as well.
Yes.
As you're talking about mass movements, I remember watching recently Noam Chomsky saying that he thought that sunrise in particular was our hope for the future. Well, there's sunrise, youth versus apocalypse, a lot of young, diverse people in Extinction Rebellion, and they're saying our membership is youth-led, and they need our help. They don't have money, they don't have numbers, they really need adult support. So trying to help the adult supporters.
Thank you. I will say, I was going to say exactly that in the second half, but yes.
Could you comment, why do you think Americans are uniquely asleep today?
So I will talk about that in the next piece, but there are some things that are unique to this country. Obviously our mythology of frontierism and rugged individualism. If you look at Europe or any traditional culture, or I would say, in fact, most other cultures of any kind, not all, Australia's a lot like us, but most of them are much more collectivist. There's less emphasis on the individual. There's less emphasis on materialism. It's surprising in a country that's as religious as we are that we're so materialist, but so that's some of it. I think there's other reasons too. There's a few ways we're unique. One is that we're the only major industrialized democracy in the world that doesn't have universal health care, that lets people buy elections, that doesn't have universal same-day voting and proportional voting systems and so forth and so on. So we have very undemocratic institutions compared to Europe and much of the world. But I'm sure there's other reasons. Yeah?
Related to this section on capitalism, the exploitive industry is only being able to do that because of the military, which is the largest polluter in the world, U.S. military. Care to comment on what we can do to act if we can't get the military to decarbonize itself? to remove them?
Well, one of the hopeful signs is that the military is one of the first big institutions to say, hey, this is a national security threat, we need to get in front of this. They haven't done a good job of it, but they're at least paying attention. They're a lot more realistic about it than, say, Exxon. We don't have tanks in the streets here like they do in some places. And so much of what goes on in this culture is manufactured consent, to use Chomsky's term. They don't need to use tanks in the streets because they've already got us compliant, and enough of us compliant enough. I'm guessing the folks in this room don't fit that category, but I think if what I've seen in a lot of the conflicts between the Pentagon and the current guy in the White House is that a lot of the folks in the military, as much as they believe in war and killing people, they also believe in protecting democracy and the Constitution, or at least in their version of it. And I think if there was a mass shift in this culture that said, we're not going to fund war, we'll have a nominal civil defense, so, you know, in case anyone invades us, but we're going to take all that money and we're going to use it to solve the most, the real threat, you know. I think they would respect that. I don't expect the military to be the folks who go get their guns and say, over my dead body. I think it's going to be some other folks. So, yes?
To not ignore some of the physical system problems, there's something called the aerosol masking effect, which is the particulates in the air are shadowing the earth and masking the heating that would be apparent if those particles fell out of the sky. And they're caused by particularly burning coal, but it's a significant amount. It's between 1 and 3 degrees Celsius. So, and it would fall out in weeks, if not, fall right out. So that's a big problem because as soon as we stop polluting, we're going to overheat.
Well, some of those particulates come from natural sources too. I mean,
Yeah.
every time that a major volcano goes off, we get almost a nuclear winter. But
and that's exactly
right.
Could be the solution too. But
yeah,
something
I don't.
in mind.
Like I said, I'm not a scientist. I can't meaningfully evaluate some of the geoengineering proposals about putting reflective particles in the upper atmosphere.
Well, it's not okay. Hansen says 1.2 degrees Celsius plus or minus 0.2, probably the higher side. Later reports of between 1 and 3 degrees C from the man-made particles in the atmosphere.
One of the few technologies I feel cautiously optimistic about is something called Arctic cloud. What is it called?
Marine cloud brightening.
Yes, cloud brightening. There's proposals to put these giant things that suck up ocean water and spew it up into the air as basically water vapor to make a reflective cloud cover above the Arctic that might provide enough reflectivity for the ice to stop melting and maybe start reforming.
Wow.
I don't know if it's a good idea or a bad idea, but it doesn't sound as scary as some of the others. So. Yes?
I wanted to ask another thing, but before I ask it, I wanted to preface it by asking the audience here, how many people in the audience are vegans? Or basically plant-based? I see a few hands,
2, 3, 4,
and I'm
5,
thinking,
6.
when I'm thinking, there's
7
people
or 8.
there's people like I saw the Bernie sign go up. Bernie's not a vegan, Ocasio-Cortez is not a vegan, Jane Fonda's not a vegan. They say, well, it sounds like a good idea, but it'd be really hard to do. Amy Goodman says, we all know who she is. She says, it really sounds good. She's had people on her show talk about how important it is, but she's not changing or advocating for it. The only talk show person I hear talk about it is Tom Hartman, who is vegan and has been one for a long time. So without that happening, and Bernie Sanders himself is from dairy country, and he's a big supporter, and he realizes a lot of his backing comes not just from big dairy industry, but small farmers and people that live there that consume dairy products. And it's maybe somewhat disappointing to see that since it is such an important, and James Hansen from NASA, and I think most people here have heard of James Hansen. He's been one of the first people that wrote a lot about climate change over 30 years ago, and he's vegan, and he said he sees it as, without that happening to all of us, if we don't change our diet, and it's not lack of protein, there's plenty of protein in plants, otherwise animals there wouldn't be hippopotamuses and elephants if there wasn't a lot of protein in plants. So I just wanted to get a feel, because I find that to be true in a lot of groups I go to. Few hands go up. So for the sake of people that didn't put their hands up, if you just dial in on a computer and just put a good, what do you say, arguments for veganism, and just see what you come up with and read them.
I want to point out it was about a fifth of the room, which is a lot higher than the international.
But that's good.
Yeah, and I also want to point out that, if I go vegan, I'm going to knock a few tons of carbon off my annual footprint. But if I convince everyone else in the room not to go vegan, but just to cut their meat consumption by 10%,
absolutely,
that's going to knock a couple hundred tons off. So, in terms of what we have to do right now, most of the country's not willing to go completely vegan, but most people are open to eating less beef, switching to chicken, eating more local, eating more organic, especially if we talk about the health impacts, or some of the climate and other impacts. We can get people closer to that without having to make it all or nothing. And that's why I honor you for being vegan, and for everyone who's not ready to go there, incremental change is still better than nothing.
Absolutely, and I'm really heartened by the fact there are 20% of the people in here, because in the United States, only 3% of the people, overall population, so we're way ahead of the
Which is still higher than it used to be. Yes?
I just wanted to mention that Kaiser recommends a plant-based meal. All their nurses went on a 21, I don't know if they stayed on it, but they recommend it, at least coming down.
Let me take one more.
Yeah, have you ever noticed how, speaking of this section on capitalism, that any solution that you come up with is immediately fought by advertising, marketing, capitalist system, so that every single one of these things, there's a big push to stop it. You can't even talk about it in some states. You're not allowed to mention it. It can't be taught. It's all done through very significant lobbying, funding, etc.
Right. There's amazing work that's been done with lawsuits, with divest and boycott movements, with policy changes from inside, electing people who are more enlightened. But those things almost never work without some kind of mass movement to push it. Progressive electeds don't get anywhere if there isn't a mass movement behind them forcing their policies through. When FDR got elected and met with some of the labor leaders and other progressive movement leaders, he said, I'm convinced, now go out there and make me do it. And that's always the situation we're in. The people inside the power structure have to be pushed to legitimize the changes they may already be open to. So, real quick.
Everybody here uses a search engine. And so rather than using Google, which will spy on you, if you switch to Ecosia, they plant trees with their profits in different parts of the world. ECOSIA, Ecosia.
Oh, yeah. Want to write on the board?
There's another one too, goodsearch.com, and you can put in, for every single search you do, they give money to charity, and you can put the exact charity that you want, whether it's your kid's soccer team, some Occupy, and it's fabulous. And they do not have privacy and censorship violation like Google does.
Oh, great.
So the other primary barrier I think we face is internal. It's the way we've been trained and conditioned as people. And I'm going to talk about this culture. I know it's very different in other places, but this is the culture I was raised in. There's some aspects to the climate crisis itself that make it hard for people to think about. It's remote. It's not immediate. Our brains were hardwired to run away from lions on the savannah. We still have a lot of that conditioning back in our reptile brain. So a threat that's abstract, remote, long-term, confusingly scientific, controversial, as long as there's denial going on. It's harder for people to respond to in the way we respond to someone, trying to grab our wallet or whatever, So if you think about someone trying to hurt someone you love while you're standing next to them, you don't have to think about what to do. You just move. Climate's not that way. So that's the first challenge. But there's also some things about how we function in this culture, how we deal with long abstract crises, even when they have immediate consequences. And I hope no one's too triggered by this slide. I know we're only a few miles from where people lost homes. But this is how it feels to me every day in this culture. I get up, I go to work, nobody talks about climate. Everyone talks as if life is going to be the same as it is now in 20 or 30 years. Maybe their phone will do a few more things. Maybe they'll be driving an electric vehicle, but that's it. Like, life is basically going to go on. And I feel like the house is on fire, as Greta says. So, and I think that creates what they call cognitive dissonance, which in this context, I mean, what I know is true doesn't fit with how everyone's acting. Everyone's pretending something. And I'm saying everyone because I think on some level, every human being feels what's going on with the planet, feels what's going on with the other living beings around them. We may not want to look at it consciously. We may go through elaborate conniptions to try and avoid it. But I think everyone's feeling it on some level. And so there's this disconnect, this dissonance. And it creates all kinds of symptoms. There's a few models. One, there's some folks like Peter Levine who've looked at how other species heal from trauma. They look at, antelopes running away from, are those cheetahs? Okay, I wasn't sure. Most animals, if you live with any animals, their natural state is relaxed awareness. So are most kids if they haven't been traumatized too much yet. The cheetah shows up. They get hyper alert, their adrenals kick in, and it's like, all right, what's going on? And they either fight, flight, or freeze. There's actually 3 options. Gazelles and creatures like that are really famous for going limp and playing dead, and no self-respecting cheetah wants to eat something that's dead already. They take action. If they do get away, they run. And then they do this interesting thing where they tremble. And that's one of the ways we release. There's other ways too: crying, shaking, laughing. We have a lot of release mechanisms. But they manage to release the trauma of having almost been eaten, and they're back to normal pretty quickly. We're wired the same way. But sometimes when we experience either a real threat or a perceived one or an imagined one, we go into reaction. We go into a different kind of freeze where we can't seem to think clearly, we can't respond appropriately, we can't stick up for ourselves, we can't interrupt what's happening, and we end up feeling very powerless. And over time and repetition, that trauma gets stored somatically in the body, to the point where it's like a broken record, and every time something reminds us in any way of one of those past traumas, it re-triggers the whole cycle. And so a lot of us are walking around with a form of PTSD that looks a lot like folks who grew up in abusive environments or were in war zones or any of those kind of things. And it may not be obvious where it's coming from if they don't have that personal history, but they're still, their adrenals are burned out, they're hyper vigilant, they're stressed most of the time, they have all the illnesses that go with that and all the coping mechanisms. We all know what some of those are because most of us have some of them too. Tuning out, denial, eating, self-medicating, workaholism, whatever it may be. I'm not going to go through all this. I just want to point out a few of them. These are some of the most relevant ones to what we're talking about. And we live in a culture where this is really, really widespread. When I was the union rep for the nurses at Sonoma I'm sorry, at Napa State Hospital, everyone had PTSD because everyone was working inside a locked ward and there were 10 assaults a day. But then I realized that the people who worked outside the locked ward and just knew about and heard about and saw their friends assault, they had it too. And then I realized I'm just coming in occasionally as a union rep and I'm getting it. And that basically everyone who has any awareness or encounters anyone who's dealing with that, it's almost contagious. And as a culture, we have symptoms too. Some of them look like acting out. We all know that people who've been abused sometimes replicate the abuse by becoming the abuser, sometimes by becoming victimized again. But we get social structures that are based on trauma, based on dysfunction as well. And I think a lot, you asked what makes America unique. We're not the only dysfunctional culture by any means in this, but we have some distinctly American forms of dysfunction that are different than what you find somewhere else. You know, if you went to, you know, Mexico or Canada or someplace else, you'd find a little slightly different flavor of craziness. So some of the structures in this culture oppress people based on their identity, based on which target group they happen to be in. So if you're not like me, white or male or middle class or able-bodied or native born or all that, you know, cis male, you may be a target of one or more oppressions. And those are a lot like, those are traumas. And they're much like the trauma of being abused as a child or assaulted or, you know, living through a war zone or something. And racism, sexism, homophobia, and so forth are not just interpersonal interactions. They're institutionalized in the culture, and they're internalized when you abuse someone enough and you tell them you're unlovable or you're stupid or you're this or you're that. The message, if the trauma doesn't get healed, the message gets in with the trauma. And these various forms of structural oppression work the same way. We all have internalized some aspects, or most of us have, if you're not enlightened, have internalized some of the messages and the forms of the oppression that the society puts on us. Obviously, if you're in a lot of target groups, you get more of it. Oppression, it's systematic. It's not just incidental. It's pervasive, it's throughout the culture, it's institutionalized, and it's intentional. It's a form of social control, and it's a form of trauma. The social conditioning we get around, the messages we get around how you're supposed to be in this culture are equally a form of oppression and create a form of collective trauma. What are some of the messages you get from the mainstream corporate culture about how you're supposed to be? Yeah, you're not rich, what's wrong with you?
Impeachments are important for some reason, more important than climate change or any social action.
Yeah, or whatever's on TV at the moment is more important, yeah.
You should have a game on, you shouldn't plant plants in, you know, to eat in your front yard.
Yeah, don't grow food, just look good, yeah.
I think over top of all this, there's this sort of convenient story veneer that we get of American exceptionalists. We're the greatest country in the world. We're the greatest people in the world. We care about each other, blah, blah, blah. There's this long list of what we're told our values are. But talk about cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, we're number one.
It's not what our culture is.
Yeah,
we just believe that that's who we are, but we're not. That's not really who we are. Oh my God, they're crazy.
Yeah, we're number one in homicides. We're number one in infant mortality. We're number one in military. Yeah, I think the core messages that we get from the culture, from the institutions that do the social conditioning, center around not being okay, you know, lack of self-worth, because that's what drives us to consume, the whole hungry ghost thing that Tibetans talk about. But they also center around powerlessness and isolation. Because when we feel, we're not actually powerless. We have power, especially when we band together to do something. But when we feel powerlessness, it keeps us compliant. It keeps us from rising up. And I want to say the climate crisis, because it affects all of us, maybe not this directly, but everyone on the planet's feeling what's going on some level. It's a form of trauma. It's a shared collective trauma. It's something we can address collectively. But if we don't take that into account, then our organizing will be limited. We'll be trying to get people to step up and take action who may not feel capable yet, who may need some support first. And the reason I'm talking so much about that is because I think there's ways to organize and build movements that allow people to heal, that allow people to reclaim their power, and others that kind of reinforce the powerlessness or the victimization, which is a form of social control. The two most inspiring figures for me are Thich Nhat Hanh and Joanna Macy, because they both in different ways talk about what happens when we experience or witness suffering or injustice. If we feel disempowered, we may try and distance ourselves from it or identify with the victim or whatever, but we will not be able to intervene, and we'll go into our coping behaviors, which include blaming people, pretending it's not happening, and so on. If we have a sense of our own power, our sense of our ability to respond, in other words, responsibility. I'm not to blame, but I am responsible for the well-being and fair treatment of my fellow being. What can I do? And it may be that you can stop it. It may be that all you can do is bear compassionate witness. I see what they're doing to you. I can't get them to stop, but I see that you're a good human being. You don't deserve it. That's still taking action, and it still makes a difference. And so the difference between the ability to engage in compassionate, aware action and not is often our own sense of our power. And so building that into our movements, I think, is essential. So the question is, how do we get out of panic mode, but stay in emergency mode so that we're responding to the actual crisis from a place of confident, assured, grounded power? Questions, comments? Yes, Sammy.
On that last slide, it reminded me about how when there's a real emergency, we can get together and do amazing things. And I'm thinking about a visit I had to the Rosie to the Riveter Museum in Richmond, where in that one shipyard, because right after after Pearl Harbor, in 3 months, 3.5 years, they built 747 ships. Just were turning them out like crazy.
In 3 months?
3 years,
3 years.
3.5 years.
Yeah.
They done.
Yeah, a lot of people look at the mobilization around World War II as a model, not of how to go to war, but of how to mobilize an entire society, an American society, for a single purpose. And I think my generation doesn't have quite as much of that gumption as my parents did, but I think it's still in us. So yeah. Yes?
I recently read a post by Rob Hopkins, one of the founders of the transition movement, talking about that model of mobilization. And he was proposing that we shift that to the model of mobilization that occurred around going to the moon. So like for 10 years before America built rockets and actually went there, it was a dream and envisioning was happening, and the way he put it was by the time we actually got to the moon, it was like we had already been there, because there was 10, not that I'm saying we need to wait 10 years, but visioning a positive thing that we can all put together, and that imagination and creativity is totally what's needed.
Absolutely.
And having a vision that we all bring our vision into, rather than a war model.
Yeah, there There was an Apollo project for a while. I think it fizzled out. But, there's a lot of models. The civil rights movement in this country, the Satyagraha movement in India. There's plenty of examples of large numbers of human beings getting together to change something, often rapidly and dramatically. So we are capable of it. Other questions, comments? Yes.
Again, the last part is a reminder for activists individually and as groups to build self-care into all of the external activism that we do.
Yeah. And to try and build certain parts of it into our movements. You know, raise your hand if you've ever been in a planning meeting that turned into a therapy group. Right. That's not what I'm talking about. Raise your hand if you've ever been part of an action or a movement or organization that actually helped you heal or grow or be more yourself. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. We can design that in to some extent. Some movements are better at it than others. Yeah.
So it seems you kind of avoid proposing an alternative to capitalism. You talk about mass movements, recognizing trauma, and collectively overcoming towards action. But what is, do you have ideas about what can replace capitalism?
Democratic socialism.
Yeah, radically.
What kind of what economic financial system?
I'd like a radically decentralized ecofeminist socialism, but I'm not attached to the exact form it takes or the exact pathway we get there. My immediate concern is helping people divorce themselves from their attachment to the current system, because I don't think we can survive with it. And I think people smarter than me are working on what the alternatives will look like. The fact that one of the major presidential candidates has made democratic socialism a part of the vocabulary is a step in the right direction. And the inspiration is coming from some other countries that are moving that or have already established that kind of society. They're not completely uncapitalist, but they're closer to what we need to be, I think.
That's one thing I don't understand about this country. Why is the word socialist a bad word to some, millions of red baiting?
Yeah.
I mean, is it still connected to the communist thing?
Yeah, there was, several generations of propaganda about communism and socialism. It was partly a cover to dismantle the labor movement and other radical and progressive movements, social justice, racial justice movements. It was partly a cover for exploiting the global South and a sort of arms race with the Soviets. But yeah, I grew up with it. I'm guessing you might have too.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I've gotten over it, It's it's still young, younger people today are still, Bernie's a socialist, we can't have that, or, I guess I put it down to unawareness that so many of the capitalist countries in this world are also socialists, like they have health care for all and all that.
Well, I know there's a few millennials in the room. I think their take on it's very different. The polling I've seen says that they like socialism better than capitalism when you ask them. I don't know how much exposure or analysis they have, but I think that's shifting. If we could just magically say that no one over 50 can vote anymore, we would solve a lot of this.
One thing I'm noticing tonight, despite the fact that this is a very grim subject, a sense of humor goes a long way. And sometimes I feel like we may even feel like it's inappropriate to have a sense of humor when the stakes are so high, but for me, it's what carries me through. And thank you for yours.
Without a sense of humor, the people perish.
I just want to speak to hope about changing things that seem impossible to change. In the late 60s, I had friends who died from illegal abortions, and nobody ever thought we were ever going to be able to change this culture. And all over the country, women became known as Jane. We all have one name, and we referred women to safe, illegal abortions. We did it underground. We found medical students and doctors who were willing to do it. And it was about 3 or 4 years after we started doing that when the Supreme Court decision went through. I feel like there was a critical mass of just people being unwilling to accept what it was and to do on a level that they could do. I didn't know all the women in, Oregon and every place else. I just knew the people I knew in LA, and they didn't know my name and I didn't know theirs. But we did something that was supposed to be impossible. I just think we need to believe that we can do impossible things.
I just want to acknowledge how incredibly courageous that work was too. Thank you.
And there are women who are still ready to do it now. And men to help them.
Yeah, we're not going back. You take a couple more. Yeah.
What about the idea that it's too late and that we should give up? I mean, maybe I shouldn't even bring that up here in this room.
You're right, it is.
People don't believe this, forget it. No, I hear that all the time in the media. It's just like, it's constant. It's too late. What are we supposed to do? Just throw up our hands?
Yeah. There's no problem, and it's too late to fix it. Yeah. I think given how scary this is, how difficult this is, how painful this is, particularly for folks who are more sensitive than me, who don't have a thick skin about it, it can be really overwhelming. And the temptation to either give up or to just look away because it feels so painful is strong. And that's why I tried to talk about the psychology. I think one of the most important things we can do in our organizing is figure out what gives people a sense of our collective power. We don't have to win every time, but we have to come away, I'm jumping ahead here, we have to come away feeling that what I did made a difference, and together we made a real difference, even if we didn't win everything we were trying for. That breaks the mythology of what can you do? You don't matter. And I think that plus feeling connected to other people who are also seeing what's going on and wanting to do something about it, I think that helps shift us out of the it's too late or I can't do anything about it. Does that? Okay. We're running a bit behind. Do people want to take a break or do you want to just self-break? Okay. No? I'm seeing mostly no's. All right. I want to talk about organizing a bit, so please take a break if you need to. And if you were going to write a resource on the board, please go ahead. All right, so I'm going to go through this section real quick. I think there are some opportunities for us to focus on in the short term that may help. Obviously, this is the biggest one. This is not a law, it's a framework. Its chance of getting through even a Democratic Congress are slim, but if it did get through, this would put the entire country, the entire economy, the whole federal government on the right track. This is I think the most serious, at the scale of the problem proposal we've seen. So I think organizing around support for this is actually helpful in it that it kind of challenges all the halfway measures that a lot of politicians throw out. I include Medicare for All as one of the key ones, not because it directly addresses climate, although it does deal directly with a lot of the impacts, both health-wise and psychological. Oh, a presidential candidate snuck in there, silly me. But the amount we waste on profit in our medical system is almost twice the military budget. It's about 8 or 9% of GDP in this country because we're spending twice what every other country does so that insurance companies and HMOs and big pharma can have huge profits. And we have 1 million people pushing paper around. This would free up enough money to address climate and free tuition and most of the other, rebuilding infrastructure, most of the stuff we need to do right away. If we can redirect the resources away from corporate profit toward what we actually need. So I think this has massive popular support. It's a very realistic possibility. And if in the process we can redirect that 6, 7, 8, 9% of GDP, all the arguments about how do we pay for the transition will be dealt with. Not as big an impact, but when I was college age, it was really easy to work part-time and spend the other half of your time organizing. It was easy to take a year or two off school, or after you were done with school, just go out and do politics and social change and, you know, live on a commune, whatever. My kids didn't have that option. They had to go find the most high-paying corporate job they could to pay off their massive debt. That's not an accident. High tuition is a deliberate, you know, and student debt is a deliberate mechanism to keep young folks from engaging in social change. This will free up a huge amount of intelligence, energy, creativity from folks who are currently stuck under a debt. I'm really ambivalent about elections and electoral work, which is ironic for someone who's done it all his life to say. But if you'll notice, the second most important issue to Democrat and Democrat-leaning voters is the climate. It actually made it into the debates a little bit, despite the corporate moderators' ignorance and refusal to address it. And so I think there's a possibility of using the election process to raise the issue, to give it visibility, to push it forward. There are also some risks with focusing on elections. It can become a distraction. Almost everything we end up doing in public policy is usually some kind of compromise. It takes resources away from other forms of action. It tends to legitimize the system. And worst of all, people think that voting means someone's going to do it for them. But with those caveats, I think this election year at least has some possibilities. One of my favorite issues, this is our local DSA chapter, by the way, yay. Right now, the public hates PG&E. They are probably the most unpopular corporate, semi-corporate entity in Northern California. There's huge popular support for a takeover. And if you look at the publicly owned and publicly run utilities, they're radically different. Instead of making a profit, they're running much safer and more affordable energy grids. Sacramento has a public utility. There's a couple others in the state. I think we're ripe for this. I don't think Sacramento has the courage unless we push them, but I think this could be a huge step forward. A publicly owned and controlled PG&E could get us a lot of the way toward the actual distributed generation, renewable energy systems we need. This dashing fellow is Captain Climate Action. This was at the birthday for Anne Hancock, who's the founder and director of the Center for Climate Protection. And the person I'm standing with is Renata Brillinger, the founder and director of California's Climate Agricultural Network. There are NGOs doing incredible work. You know, the really hard, grueling work of getting in and pushing policy. You know, I find public meetings deadly dull a lot of the time, and I'm really in awe of anyone who can wade through EIRs and all that stuff. CCA actually stands for Community Choice Aggregation, which is something Sonoma County did, Marin, I think 6 or 8 counties in the state have already done it. It basically gives us the ability to switch every homeowner and small business over to a clean energy source, and you have to opt out to go back to PG&E's dirtier energy. And it's one of the biggest, arguably the biggest success we've had in Sonoma County, or one of them anyway. So a big fan of that. Just some of the work that's being done to try and get a meaningful plan and policy in place for our county. Climate mobilization, I've heard of them for a while, but I never looked at them. I just started reading their stuff. Sounds interesting. They seem to have a grasp of it. This is the climate plan that Ann's group came up with. It's excellent. This is the plan the county's actually under right now. It's less excellent.
Daniel, that's been found invalid by the court.
Oh, thank you to all the attorneys.
Account for greenhouse gas emissions from cross-boundary tourism and global transport of goods, primarily wine.
Yeah.
So if there's no CAP, that has been invalidated, and the RCPA, the Regional Coalition for Climate Protection, is working, I understand, on a revision of it, but this happened in 2018. The case said it was invalid because they didn't account for a significant contribution to greenhouse gases.
Thank you. That from a lifelong environmental attorney. Huge kudos to anyone who's using the courts or the EIR process or any of that to fight. The last thing I want to say about this is we need mass movements, but we also need support groups. Community gardens, skill sharing, permaculture, and perhaps most of all, we need people who are raising kids, teaching, healing, doing counseling and body work, people keeping us sane and functional. That's as important as any of the other work we do. And so if that's what the niche someone finds to help us get to where we need to go, I salute that. I self-identify as an organizer and activist, but I recognize that all those other things are at least as important. If you're raising a sane kid, that's probably the greatest impact you can have on the planet. Any brief questions or comments? I'm gonna push. Yes, Susan.
It may seem a little off topic, but there was something there about the Democratic Party, and you said Democrat Party. And there was a thing a while ago, this is a number of years ago, where the Republicans realized that it was really bad to have the word Democratic, which is viewed very positively, connected with the Democratic Party. And they started dropping the IC and making it Democrat. And it's amazing how many Democrats went along with that canard. And in the same way that we were told, and I don't think it came from the left, protests don't work. We have to listen to the things we hear repeated over and over again and think about where is that coming from, and maybe not listen.
They were saying protests don't work, but I'm still going to fund this Tea Party group. 40-something% of Californians are not registered as Democrats, Republicans. That percentage goes up every year. About 1 in 5 voters are party loyalists. The rest of them are not voting a straight party ticket because it's a party ticket. They're voting for who they think will
And I'm not talking about the parties, because I'm not. I'm Green Party. But I'm talking about the way our thinking gets controlled and how our language gets controlled.
So I think we're ripe for something different, but I won't go in. Let's not do elections right now.
Daniel, how does the Sonoma Clean Power fit into the PG&E takeover, or just switch like that?
Okay, so my wife and I, we get our power through a community choice aggregation, which is Sonoma Clean Power. It mostly comes from the geysers, which is geothermal, so it's all renewable. We pay a very slight premium, but it's basically competitive. Because I plug my car in and I drive a hell of a lot for work, our PG&E bill is probably $250, $300 a month. If it's $300, about $90 is for the power, and the other $200 is for PG&E delivering the power. And I wish the PUC would do something about that. But then, if we took over PG&E, there are already more than 12 cities that have offered or asked to buy the infrastructure, the poles, the lines, the liability, yes, the lack of maintenance. But cities and counties in the state are chafing at the bit to take over that grid. and to make it work for people instead of profit. The only people that PG&E serves is its shareholders. The only people. They come before safety, they come before fire protection, they come before affordable rates or inspections or anything else. And that's something that right now everyone, not just those of us in fire areas, is supportive of. So I think there's a small window of opportunity that may not be there in a year or two to push the legislature and the governor. I think Newsom would be receptive to this. He's already made noises about a takeover. They're going to back away from that unless we push them. So.
Thank you. Is there a bill or anything, or what is going? How do we push them?
I know there's groups working on this. I don't know who they are, other than maybe Turn.
Bill Dodd talks about it, so.
That's surprising. He's not the most radical guy in Sacramento, but if Bill Dodd's on it, then it's mainstream. So.
McGuire's too. Mike McGuire's also.
Yeah. I would expect everyone except maybe Mark Levine, who's useless, to be out in front of this.
Thank you.
Just real quickly, I think to build the kind of movements we need to turn this around, they're going to have to be locally based, but also globally focused. A lot of the movements are already quite well networked. This is not an environmental issue. This is an issue about people's lives, people's ability to protect their families, to be safe and get health care, to be free from social injustice. If we don't make this a social and economic justice movement, we're not going to succeed, because the same systems that are pushing us off the cliff of climate change are the same systems that are keeping those other forms of injustice in place. It's a single movement, and the most encouraging and I think successful parts of it that I've seen have been the ones that address that. I think strategically nonviolent, I'm not an absolutist about that, but I don't see a lot of circumstances in this country where violent armed resistance makes sense. And grassroots and democratic, because we have to model the world we want to see. We're not going to create an egalitarian world by acting in authoritarian ways. And most importantly, people respond to a vision. A lot of the reason people aren't sure what to do, it's not because the issue's complex or conflicting or anything, it's because they're not sure where it is we're trying to go. And the clearer and more powerful and attractive our vision is, the better. Kevin Donaher used to talk about, we're all on the Titanic and it's going down, and there's some people in a scruffy little lifeboat saying, come with us, and it's like, yeah, I don't know. And then these people pull up on a tiki raft, and they've got music going, and they're making fresh fruit organic margaritas, and it's like, who do you want to stay on the Titanic, or you want to go with them? He was talking about making our movement so much fun and attractive that people want to join. So why do people join movements? Obviously, a lot of us, particularly in this room, it's probably mostly because we want to make a difference. We recognize the urgency, the need. And that means we have to claim and celebrate our victory, something the left has been very poor at. When we win, we need to name it. Do I have time for it? I probably don't have time, but I'll tell us anyway. Daniel Ellsberg, years ago, was doing research for a book. He was reading all the private papers of various presidents and Security Council, what do we call the head of national security advisors? And what he found is that every single president from Eisenhower on through, not Ford because he was only in for a year, but Eisenhower through Nixon and Reagan, seriously talked about and considered in the National Security Council a preemptive first strike nuclear weapons use. So, China, Korea, Bay of Pigs, the Iran hostage crisis, they all talked about it as a serious option. And he said in every single case, in reading through their memoirs and so forth, what stopped them wasn't any humanitarian concern. In at least the first couple cases, it wasn't fear of retaliation, because some of it was before the Soviets had retaliatory capability. It certainly wasn't concern about the ethics of it. The reason they didn't do it in every single case what he found was because they thought the nation would become ungovernable, because we would rise up and take them out of office. And so what that means is that every day for the last 70 years, you and you and you have prevented nuclear war. Now, we don't know that, so we don't claim it. But those are the kind of things that we need to own so that everyone in our movements knows they're going to deny it, but the reason this corporation stopped doing this or the reason this legislation got passed is because we leaned on them. People join because they want to be part of something larger than themselves.
Keep the pitchforks handy.
Yes. And so we need to include everyone. We need to create movements that have a sense of community, where people feel that they have a place. This may not be your strong motivator, but it is for some people. There's an identity. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm kind of half joking when I talk about the cool factor, I was part of the strike, got my t-shirt. But there's also a deeper part, which is I want to be a decent human being. I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror and say, this is who I am. And so people, to find that sense of self-identity, will join and stay in movements. And finally, a lot of the things that give people in more traditional cultures meaning and purpose and identity, we don't have as much of here. Some folks still do. But for those of us who don't have a direct connection to our ancestry, to how they lived and what they spoke and ate and stuff, who aren't part of some deep faith community or something, there may be a lack of that. And being part of a movement, if it's principled, if it's ethical, can give people that. I think it's important that we approach this not as some weird little thing we're doing temporarily and then we just go back to voting and watching TV. Dissent and direct action is an essential part of democracy. It's as essential as elections or courts or anything else. We're building a culture. And anytime you build a culture, there are some opportunities to make conscious choices. What are our symbols? What are our stories? What are our values? Do we dance when we win a victory? How do we come together? And I don't think of this as a religious movement, but I do think of this as a spiritual movement. I'm not religious, but I think that there's an element that's going to have to be essential. If we're going to get as big and move as quickly as we need to, people have to feel a sense of that there's something at least ethical. If spiritual is not your word either, that there's something ethical, something moral, something deeply values-based about what we're doing. That we're saying we want a world where all life matters, where we live in balance, where we're egalitarian, where we treat everyone with respect, where we do not destroy what sustains life. And there's a lot of pragmatic reasons, I think, in order to go the long run, to maintain the kind of discipline and accountability we need with each other, and to provide enough support to adapt to the kind of radical changes we're going to have to go through. We need a movement that's not issue-based, but is value-based. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm going to plow through the last few. This is one of my brother's things. So I work for a union. I wear a lot of purple, so you might know which one. There's some things unions aren't very good at anymore, but one of the things they're really good at is knowing what they're after. We're real clear. We want a 3.5% increase on this, and we want 80% coverage of that, and we want language on this. We know what we're after. If we get it, we usually go home and be quiet. But this is county workers striking against a takeaway. The county decided they were going to take retiree health care away from retirees after they were no longer employees and no longer in the union and couldn't organize. And so the folks who were employees and were in the union said, these are our parents, our older siblings, these are our union brothers and sisters, we're going to fight for them. And they got the county to back down. We need to know who the target is. I way too many times hear someone say, well, why are we doing this particular action? Well, because it's what we do. Okay, who are we trying to impact? Well, I don't know. We need to know who exactly our target is, who can make the change we want, and how do we leverage them most effectively. This is the protest in Pelosi's office. There's some great footage, I don't know if you've seen it, of her being a complete twit with these really earnest, articulate kids. It wasn't so much AOC as the kids who were speaking to her, and she just wasn't listening to it. It was. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. You're right. It was Feinstein. Thank you. Good correction. Yeah. Pelosi would have handled it better, definitely. Yeah. So it was Feinstein proving how out of touch she was. But is it? Oh. Okay. This is a different day. I have the wrong photo in here. That's worth noting. Okay. But if you saw the kids in Feinstein's office, it was really a remarkable interchange. And in a sense, Feinstein was the target, but in a larger sense, everyone who saw that video that went viral on YouTube was the real target. And I think Feinstein took some long-term political damage from that. And everyone else who's running for high office is going to look at that and say, I probably don't want to do that. I'm going to skip this. We need to have a strategy, but we also need in each situation to figure out which tactics work best. Do we want to get all serious and confrontational with the Nazis? Sometimes, yes. And I have some really courageous friends who are more willing to get assaulted than I am. But these folks decided the best way to deal with Nazis in their town was to make fun of them. And so they all came as clowns. This is part of the white flower movement. I like whole grain, but what the? So in every situation, there isn't one tactic that fits every move in every situation. One of the things I love about the Hong Kong protests is how creative they've been. I feel like there's a whole new playbook of tactics that we're learning from them. Mostly I've been reading. I hear reports of what they're up to, but in terms of how they figured out rapid communication systems that are not phone dependent, we need 6 gas masks and 2 umbrellas and some bandages. They can send that signal all the way to the back of the crowd and get the stuff passed up to the front like that. Yeah, and they've been using things like umbrellas really creatively.
It seems strange to me, though, that some of the places like the Hong Kong people and the Paris people, they're burning things down and breaking windows and doing that kind of thing.
That's the stuff that makes the news. What you don't see is the 50, 100,000 people who are not doing that, who are holding a line against police, sometimes violent police, and not engaging in that. If it's corporate or even mainstream media, take it with a grain of salt, because when you have 100,000 people marching and 5 of them break windows, guess who's going to be on the news? This is actually a right-wing nationalist Ukraine party meeting. And I put it in to be funny, but my point is we need to walk our talk. I've been in too many movements and organizations where we wanted to create a world, but we weren't acting those values out. And so every action is an opportunity to embody that, I'm going to skip this too. I want to suggest that the leadership of this movement needs to not look like me, by and large. I think Naomi Klein's the best voice we got around the critique of the capitalist system in terms of climate. I have not read her new book, but this is what it looks like. I'm going to read it next. I did go back and reread the one that's on the handout. I forget. This changes everything. Thank you. I read it again. This is probably the single most significant mobilization we've had in this country, the women's marches the last few years. This is our local one. This is who's going to lead this movement forward when I get too feeble to do it, and some of us. And it's incredibly inspiring. And someone said at the beginning of the evening, we need to support the Sunrise, the youth strikes, all of the things that folks who are younger than us are doing, and be there as resources and support people, but not get in their way. Let them move as quickly as they're going to move. These are some of the kids that were in the lawsuit, probably the most significant climate lawsuit in the country, arguably. They just had a setback, but they are going to another level of appeal. There's a lot of leadership coming from communities of color, which is really critical. Black Lives Matter has really, again, changed how we do protests in this country for the better, and not least of which is it made intersectionality part of the common vernacular. This is an issue about race, about immigration, about economic justice, about access to health care, about food sovereignty, about all those things. This is not, as I said, an environmental issue. And if we're working with all those movements, then we're probably going to win. If we're not, if we're in a little silo of, well, I'm a climate activist, so I'm not coming to your Black Lives Matter march, we're probably not going to win. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that I don't have a famous nationally recognized indigenous leader to put up on the screen like Greta and AOC and Naomi. There's a reason for that, and it's not just that I don't know those leaders. I think there's not as much room for indigenous leaders to step up. I barely know who these folks are, but they're all doing an amazing work. And Standing Rock and I Don't Know More in Canada have also really changed the face of protests and direct action in ways that I think brought an incredible amount of a new sense of what it means to do this work with integrity, to do it with connectedness to the land, to traditions. And I think we can follow their lead without slipping into cultural appropriation. There's a tendency to, among some of us, myself included, to say, well, yeah, it's nice to get everyone to come out to a march, but what does that do? We really need something more impactful and more focused. I think because of the need to rapidly build larger and larger movements, we need both. I don't think it's an either or. This is a protest at Governor Brown's Climate Summit, by the way, a couple years ago. There are some tactics that are less strategic. This is an Extinction Rebellion activist who got on top of a commuter train during commute hour to stop it. And when interviewed, he said, I just want to disrupt things. He was pulled down and roughed up, is I think the phrase the press used. I don't know how badly hurt he was, but he was pulled down from that train by angry commuters who were just trying to go to work and make a living. These are youth activists in Chile where there was they doubled the public transit fares and made them unaffordable for working folks. And they just took over the turnstiles and said everyone rides for free. And the bus and train drivers went along with it. The unions went along with it. Other parts of civil society joined in, and they basically forced the government to back down. We need to ask, who are we really acting in behalf of? You know, if there's people who can't be on the front line with us, are we serving their interests? Or are we, however well-intentioned, acting out of a place of privilege where we're not thinking about, because if this movement doesn't lift up working people, poor and working people, it's not going to work. I'm not ideologically opposed to smashing things. Some of my favorite people are in Black Bloc and don't do a lot of this, but do a lot of protecting people with their bodies. But everyone saw this on the news, and that was all they saw. And all the incredible work Occupy did in Oakland got made invisible when this was all that was reported. This is also damage and property destruction, but it was reported very differently. And so there's some questions to ask about who this, not only what the direct action itself is, but how it fits into the larger strategy. Does this move the movement forward? Does it build allies, or does it alienate people and make them afraid to join us? Glad to say these folks were acquitted. So I was talking about indigenous actions, particularly Standing Rock. I think there's a way that some people, and I don't know how to do this, but some people bring a moral presence. Some of the Quakers or Catholic social worker folks I've been arrested with do this. There's a way of being present that bears a moral witness to whatever's going on, and I don't know how to explain it, but it stops police in their tracks sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. And the more we can learn from people who know how to do that, the better. Every action's actually a story, and the story's probably as important or more important than the action. This is my brother David, who teaches people to do street theater and build giant puppets. They did an action at the Pacific Stock Exchange where they dressed up as Robin Hood and his merry men and threw fake money. It, just clogged up the stock exchange for a little while. It didn't have a huge direct impact, but the story it told was the point, or the main point. This book talks about framing. This book talks a little more deeply or mythically about creating a story. And so everything we do is a story. And people respond on a much more symbolic level than a rational level a lot of times. And so if we find the right story, figure out who the heroes are, who the most sympathetic person to tell the story is, and what the message of the story is, our actions are going to be a lot more successful. And the reason I think, I want to wrap up with this, our imagination is our most powerful weapon, our most powerful tool, I should say. Our ability to imagine a better world, to imagine other ways to do this. And so any action that sparks people's imagination, that appeals to their creativity, that has humor, that has playfulness, that has outrage, but portrayed in a way that's telling a story, is going to be far more effective. Imagination is what breaks through our social conditioning, our hopelessness, our stuckness, our inability to see anything different. And so when we make what we're doing a story about a better world, it really invites people in. And I will end it there.